Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar hosted by Luxembourg for Transparency, L4T. This is part of our Transparency in Practice series. My name is Lena Hoffman. I'm co-founder of L4T, and I am delighted to be your moderator today. And Timo Modine is co-hosting with me yet again. So thank you very much, Timo.
Sure. No, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. So just a little bit about our association. L4T is a newly formed, non-partisan, independent non-profit here in Luxembourg. We are dedicated to advancing transparency, integrity, and anti-corruption in Luxembourg and beyond. We recognize the transnational nature of corruption and many financial misconduct and financial crimes. Today's webinar is very much in the spirit of our mission, with its focus on transparency, how we understand it, how we measure it objectively. And today we are zooming in on Luxembourg's position in key metrics of transparency and looking at how leading benchmarks view Luxembourg, ways in which these benchmarks are complementary, the dynamics in which they differ, and how they give us a triangulated and nuanced view of transparency here in Luxembourg. So to help us unpack this, we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by the actual coordinators of key large-scale indexes. First, we will be hearing from Dr. Roberto Martínez Kukutschka, research expert at Transparency International and the coordinator of the Global Corruption Barometer. And Roberto will be taking us through the flagship Corruption Perception Index, the CPI, and what it tells us about Luxembourg. So, Roberto, good afternoon. From Luxembourg to Berlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the very warm welcome. It's great to be here for the second webinar. Let me try to share my screen now with some of the slides. Let's see, this should work. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, all right. So yes, as Lena was saying, what I want to do today is take you through some of the insights and some of the findings that I guess we have about Luxembourg through the, let's call them, global measurement tools that Transparency International has. These are the Corruption Perceptions Index and the Global Corruption Barometer. I would like to start with a bit of a caveat, I guess, or a bit of a side question, because both of these metrics are perception-based in a way. And I think there is a lot being said about the utility of perceptions, or whether we should be measuring corruption through perceptions. And I believe that this is an incredibly important thing to do for a number of reasons. First, as we know from behavioral sciences, perceptions often drive behavior. This is something that we see also in economics, that we see in many other fields. The fact that citizens often make decisions not really based on what reality is, but rather on their perceived reality, right? This is what drives consumer behavior. This is what drives voting behavior, investing behavior, and so on. So this is why, even though perceptions might not be, let's say, the hard reality, it is very important to keep an eye on them. And we know that, for example, when it comes to corruption, the perception that perhaps your peers are benefiting from corruption or engaging in bribery, for example, might also be a motivation for you to engage in those same activities. So this is why keeping an eye on them is extremely important. The second, and this is why as well, perception can be this self-fulfilling prophecy at times, right? As we know as well, if you think that everyone is paying bribes and benefiting from that, you would be the odd one out trying to be and do the right thing, which can be a hard thing to do. So honest actors might actually be disincentivized from acting that way. Again, this is why it's important to keep an eye on these perceptions. And finally, perceptions by themselves can erode the legitimacy and compliance. So perceived corruption reduces trust, we know this, but also the willingness to follow rules. And it can also weaken then the state capacity to sort of enact other policies, right? So this is why I think it is very important to keep an eye on the results of indices like the Corruption Perceptions Index, the World Bank's Control of Corruption, and surveys like the Global Corruption Barometer, but also the insights from corruption-related surveys like the Eurobarometer, for example, which I will also be discussing. Now, just for the sake of what we're going to discuss now, I would like to start with a little bit of a caveat as well on the methodology of the Corruption Perceptions Index, because I believe that it is extremely important to know precisely what we're measuring so that we can then discuss it with the nuance that it is required. Because I think every measurement of corruption, given that this is a difficult concept to measure, will have its shortcomings, right? And of course, the CPI has shortcomings like every other tool. So I think that's why it is important to sort of set the record straight, so to speak, on what the index can and cannot do, what it captures and what it doesn't. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the Corruption Perceptions Index is a composite indicator. This means that Transparency International only gathers data that is already out there that measures corruption. And this is important. All of these indicators need to be based on expert assessments or business surveys, and they all need to measure corruption in the public sector. So there's a bunch of corrupt-related behaviors or types of corruption that the Corruption Perceptions Index does not cover, and that is important to keep in mind. So a lot of many activities related to money laundering, related to illicit financial flows, for example, all of these phenomena do not fall within the scope of the Corruption Perceptions Index. We are only measuring integrity, so to speak, in the public sector. So just as a quick list, this is everything you see now on the screen on the left-hand side are phenomena that are captured one way or another in the Corruption Perceptions Index. What you see on the right-hand side is not. So it might be tempting, and this is something that we at Transparency International get a lot, it might be tempting to also say, well, why don't you just expand the index to include everything? We have tried this in the past. There have been experiments about it, but we need to have some conceptual cohesion in what goes into the CPI. And what we know is that the behaviors that you see on the left all tend to co-vary together, whereas the ones that you see on the right do not necessarily go hand in hand with what we see on the left, and that basically excludes them from being able to form part of a composite indicator. So what I'm saying is these two things, what you see on the left and what you see on the right, are not the same thing and hence need to be measured separately. In terms of data sources or where the information from the Corruption Perceptions Index comes from, it comes from an overall, 13 different sources from 12 different organizations that range from multilateral banks like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, some financial risk assessment services like S&P or the Economist Intelligence Unit, some academic sources like the Varieties of Democracy dataset, and some NGOs like Freedom House or the World Justice Project. And we also have other organizations such as the World Economic Forum or the Bertelsmann Foundation that also provide data for the Corruption Perceptions Index. Important to know, we only take into account, like I said earlier, data related to corruption. So if an organization like the World Justice Project has data on corruption in their broader rule of law index, this doesn't mean that the whole rule of law index goes into the CPI. We only take the variables or components that measure corruption directly. And then in terms of how the index is calculated, it's a fairly simple process where we simply collect and harmonize the data, then just standardize it based on the global mean and standard deviation, then just rescale the data on a scale from 0 to 100. Some of the sources come from in a scale from 1 to 7, some 0 to 1. Some are already on the scale of 1 to 100, but all of them need to be rescaled together so that we can then calculate the CPI and so the average of all sources and the metrics of uncertainty, which are important because of what we'll see in a second. Now, leaving all of this theoretical and technical things aside, let's just dive into the results and what the CPI tells us about Luxembourg. Perhaps first as a global overview of where we stand. Currently, this is what the global picture looks like. We have a global average of 42 on the scale of the CPI, which is 0, which means very corrupt, to 100, which would be very clean. The average, like I said, is 42. And as you can see, most of the world here is colored in dark or in dark red or orange. And the regions that you see in yellow are those where we see the least corruption in the public sector as measured by the CPI. And when we zoom into Europe, the picture is slightly different in the sense that we have an average of 62, which is significantly higher from what we see around the globe, showing that the European Union or Western Europe remains one of the regions with the best control of corruption. And in this context, Luxembourg is the 4th country in the region with the highest score. And it's also the 8th globally. Now, this might sound great, and in a way it is, and I think it needs to be recognized that it is a very good score and very good standing. But I think it's also important to look at not just what the score is this year, but how the score has evolved. And this is just what the picture of overall Europe looks like when we look at how CPI scores have changed. Now you see the scores that have improved over the past decade and a half. You see them in green, and the ones that you see colored red here are scores that have declined significantly, so beyond the margin of measurement error that we have. And in the case of Luxembourg, it is one of the countries where we see decline. The country has gone from a score of 85 back in 2015 to 78 in 2025 in our latest edition. So I think that is important to keep in mind. In the global context, where does this stand? Well, you can see here how the map sort of flips a little bit when we see where improvement and decline is happening globally. So unfortunately, we have more countries where the scores have declined over time than where it has improved, with 50 countries having worse scores now on the Corruption Perceptions Index than they did a decade ago, and only 31 countries where we see better scores now. And like I was saying, as you can see here on the map, a lot of Western Europe is actually colored red, which is quite concerning given that it is the region where we used to see the highest scores. I mean, we still do, but I guess this shows that just being at the top of the index does not mean you cannot fall behind and backslide, right? Now, what we see here, I mean, it's probably difficult to read, but these are the sources that give us data for Luxembourg. As you can see, we have the World Economic Forum, PRS Country Risk Guide, the IMD World Competitiveness Index, the World Justice Project, VDEM, the Global Insights, and the EIU Country Risk. Most of the sources give a very similar assessment to the country, which is why it has a fairly small margin of error when we look at the country. But the EIU country risk rating, which is measuring budget transparency, misappropriation of funds, and merit-based appointments in the public sector, is basically what is dragging the score of Luxembourg a little bit down. At the same time, if you look at the score from the World Economic Forum, which is a business survey on mostly bribes being paid for certain services and deviation of public funds, that is where the country ranks a little bit better. So I think that is important to keep in mind, and I will give a little bit more context on this later based on what we see now, looking beyond the Corruption Perceptions Index. So some of this evidence is a little bit older, but bear with me for a second. The last time we ran the Global Corruption Barometer, which is a representative survey of people's views, experiences with corruption, was in 2021. And I have some of the, I would say, highlights of the survey for Luxembourg here. So perhaps not unsurprisingly and in line with what one would expect from the Corruption Perceptions Index, only 2% of people in Luxembourg who had contact with a public service the year before the survey said that they had paid a bribe. At the same time, what we did measure at the time is that 39% of people in Luxembourg used personal connections to obtain a public service in the country at the time. And where we see the highest risks here, or where we saw the most people complaining about corruption in Luxembourg, was when it came to issues that related to the relationship between politics and businesses, and also when it came to the perception of corruption in the banking and the private sector. So these are things that the Corruption Perceptions Index does not capture, and I guess speaks a bit about what the challenges in Luxembourg are, and those that fall outside of the CPI, so to speak. So as you can see from the data that we had from 2021, 44% of people in Luxembourg, or I mean, this was a representative sample, or 44% of the people who responded to the survey, thought that the government is run by a few big interests. Sorry, it was 43%. And only 44% thought that the government took the people, like the views of, let's say, normal people or regular citizens into account when making decisions. And when it comes to corruption by institution, Luxembourg, in private, especially in public institutions, Luxembourg performed very well. But if you see here down the list, when we look at business executives and bankers, that is a little bit where the perceptions of corruption are way higher than in the public sector, right? And if now we compare these results that we obtained from the Global Corruption Barometer with the latest edition of the Eurobarometer that was just done last year, we do not have one-to-one comparison for the questions, but I guess some of these things still prevail in the sense that according to the Eurobarometer, of course, the experience of corruption in the country tends to be very low. So in Luxembourg, we have around 6% of people saying that they experienced corruption versus 94% saying that they didn't witness or experience corruption in any way. It's not the same as asking people if they paid a bribe directly, but that question was unfortunately taken out of the Eurobarometer. And when it comes to the perceptions of how business and politics operate in the country, I guess that is where we do see, as we did in the Global Corruption Barometer, we do see increasing concern from the general public. So when the question was whether too close links between business and politics lead to corruption in the country, 69% of people in Luxembourg said that this was indeed the case. And this is an increase of 11 points from the previous edition of the Eurobarometer. And when asking, for example, whether favoritism and corruption in Luxembourg were hampering business competition, 60% of people in the country answered positively to this question, which is, again, an increase of 9% here. And finally, when asked if having political connections was the only way to succeed in business in the country. 53% of people in Luxembourg said that was the case. This is a 15-point increase from the previous edition and above the EU average of 51 for the latest survey. So I guess in a way, the picture that is painted with data from the Corruption Perceptions Index, the Global Corruption Barometer, and the CPI, I think tells a cohesive story of how, in many ways, public institutions in Luxembourg seem to be working well. Public services in Luxembourg seem to be working well. And that explains, I guess, the low levels of bribery, the low level of perceptions of corruption as gathered by the Corruption Perceptions Index. But at the same time, there are concerns and there are red flags, I would say, that started now to be picked up also by the Corruption Perceptions Index, but they are coming mostly, I guess, from this interaction between business and politics and how those are measured and dealt with in the country. So I guess just as the key takeaways for this, like I said at the beginning, Luxembourg scores well in general in these indicators, but no position is permanent. We are starting to see some backsliding. And even though there are some real institutional strengths, it might be necessary to rethink a little bit what is missing in terms of perhaps transparency, legal frameworks, and so on. The second is that perceptions do tell us a story. The GCB and the Eurobarometer show that many people in Luxembourg still feel that their daily lives are affected by corruption, even if this is not directly the type of corruption measured by the Corruption Perceptions Index. And finally, like I said from the beginning, even though the Corruption Perceptions Index doesn't capture everything, I think it is worth looking beyond it, perhaps into issues like illicit financial flows, private sector corruption, and also the levels of transparency in the country that could help us, let's say, improve the situation and revert the trend that the country has been displaying on the Corruption Perceptions Index. So I will leave it at that. I hope I didn't go over time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Roberto, for that really comprehensive picture. And you kept to time. So really, you had till 25 past. So we're well within that time mark. And it's really good to see the granularity of the Eurobarometer data and drawing out, those business and politics links that open up different ways of us understanding transparency challenges and opportunities here in Luxembourg. So to complement what the picture that Roberto has painted for us and started us off with, we're shifting gears a bit. So I'm pleased to introduce Nicolas Sebastian Soto Troncoso. He's a PhD student at Louis University and a research fellow at ERCAS, that is the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building, where he coordinates the Transparency Index. So Nicolas will be guiding us through both the T Index and their Political Finance Transparency Index. And just before I hand off to Nicolas, we have had the pleasure of publishing research stemming from Bridgecap's work. The paper was published just yesterday, written by Sylvia Guili, who was involved in the research and looked at the political finance disclosure in Luxembourg. So Timo has kindly put that in the chat, so you can access the paper there. It's an evidence-based analysis with lots of interesting things to say about municipality level transparency. With that, Nicolas, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Lina. I'm going to share my screen, so please let me know if you can see it. Yes, it's again.
Yeah, it's coming up. Yeah, it's here.
Oh, Okay, perfect. I also cannot see you, so I will do it as Roberto.
I promise we're still here.
Okay, great. Moving on, what I'm going to present is two different indices that basically try to provide actionable measurements of transparency to control corruption. So I'm speaking of the Transparency Index, this is the T Index, and the novel Political Finance Transparency Index that was developed in the context of Bridge Gap. What I'm going to do is that basically I'm going to try to explain what is the problem that we are trying to tackle with these two different indices, a little bit about the methodology for data collection, also for granting scores, and then just very briefly about the results in Luxembourg, both for the Transparency Index and for the Political Finance Transparency Index. So what's the problem that creates the necessity of these tools? The problem is the difficulty to assess the impact of transparency measures on corruption. So there is this idea that the implementation of transparency measures should help control of corruption in different ways. But if we see after the implementation across the world, and in particular in Europe, of these kind of measures, it's very difficult to see the impact that actually these policies are having on control of corruption. The problem is twofolded. The first one is that legislation by itself is not enough to produce any impact if these policies are not properly implemented. And also there's an issue with measurement. How do we measure real de facto transparency? Not only the enactment of legislation, but also what governments are actually putting in place. So what we are looking is to provide is a measurement that not only describes deficiencies in policy implementation, but also to provide a roadmap for improvement in the countries that we are assessing. So enters the index. This is developed by the European Research Center for Anti-Corruption and State Building. This is led by Professor Alina Mungiu-Pipiri. The first version of the T index is from 2021, and the current version is from 2025. The T index currently provides a survey of 143 countries and basically directly measures fiscal, administrative, and judicial transparency. So how the T index works, and here I try to explain a little bit about the methodology. The idea is that we try to assess 14 de facto indicators of public transparency, and this based on the main legal commitments made by governments. The idea is that we take the treaty provisions that you can find in the UNCAC, and then we try to compare the legal commitments of governments regarding these treaty provisions and what they actually put in place. There are three different types of transparency that are being measured with this index. The first one is fiscal transparency, for instance, past and current expenditures of central government. Administrative transparency, for instance, business register and public procurement. And also judicial transparency, for instance, Supreme Audit Institutions report and the publication of Supreme Court sentences. The idea is that we try to go directly to the sources and we try to assess, responding to this question, what is the information that is actually fully available and accessible online. So how do we do this? We normally start with a crowdsourcing process. So basically we send emails to government agencies, civil society organizations, and individual experts, and we ask for feedback. So basically, we have the indicators, and we ask these agencies and individuals to go to the websites that we have identified as the sources of the information, and for them to give us their opinion regarding about how accessible, how available this information is, and what is the gap between the legal commitments made by governments and the information that can actually be found in these websites. After receiving the information from these individuals and agencies, we do our own assessment. So basically, we grant scores and assess the implementation gap. So one of the outputs of this index is we try to find what is the distance between transparency de jure and transparency de facto, what is the distance between government legal commitments and the actual transparency that has been implemented. As I was saying, the idea is not to only say what are the deficiencies, but we tried for this information to be actionable. So, for instance, we try to propose a specific transparency policies with regard to the sectors that need development, but also we try to identify best practices and benchmarks. So, for instance, if a country has a deficiency of a certain sector, we try to provide information about other countries that have implemented good policies with that respect, and kind of like provide an example for further policies in the countries that we are assessing. So going specifically to the case of Luxembourg, what you can see here is the overall performance of the country. Luxembourg shows 62.5% of fulfillment, which basically situates the country both below the income group average and the regional average. So as we can see, when we go specifically to transparency policies, the picture is a little bit different from the picture that we were seeing with Roberto. Luxembourg in this index is not a top country, it's not a top performing country. On the opposite, is below both the income group average and the regional average. And also we can see how this, for instance, can be reflected in situations. For instance, Luxembourg withdrawing from OGP partnership in 2023. Now, here we can go to the more disaggregated information about public transparency in Luxembourg. As I was saying, we have 14 de facto indicators about fiscal transparency, about administrative transparency and judicial transparency. And given the time constraints, I would like to focus only in one aspect of the country performance, which is administrative transparency. So, for instance, in the case of the indicator public procurement portal, the website Portal des Marchés is the repository of public tenders and awards. However, the information that is available in this website is rather limited, as not all tenders and awards are published there. So just an example, in the case of awards, for instance, looking at this website today, it's only possible to find around 440 contracts published since 2016 without a clear criteria to decide their publication. So basically, the amount of awards that you can find this website kind of like gives an image that not all the information about this contract is being published on the website. Disclosure of assets and conflicts of interest for public officials is also a weak point in Luxembourg public transparency. We can say that at least two issues affect the availability of this information. The first one is that no official filing system exists for civil servants, as it is confirmed by the project Eurobarometer, and also the declarations of financial interest that you can find available in the website of the Deputies Chamber provide very, very limited information. And for instance, there is no information or no data related to gift. Last, with administrative transparency, there is no dedicated and centralized website where citizens can find the building permits that have been granted or rejected in the city of Luxembourg. So I just wanted to show some of the components of administrative transparency to try to explain what is the current situation in this index of Luxembourg. Now, so following with this assessment, we have some recommendations, particularly regarding administrative transparency. So, of course, publish and regularly update all tenders and contracts awards on the national portal. Also, in the case of financial disclosure, the recommendation is to implement an effective asset and interest declaration system together with a mandate for the online publication, the independent verification, and clear sanctions in cases of non-compliance. And finally, a recommendation regarding building permits is the creation of a centralized portal where all applications, decisions, and award can be searched and found. Okay. An additional tool is now available on BridgeGap data, and is the Political Finance Transparency Index. This index measures both the strength of legal frameworks and the real availability of information, but particularly regarding these components that you can see here. So we have two different sub-indices that compose this index. The first one is the jure sub-index that measures basically legal obligation of disclosure regarding both income and expenses of political parties and candidates, and also the de facto sub-index that measures the real availability of information regarding this legal obligation. So you can see here that basically we are following the same logic as with the T-index. We are trying to measure not only the jure reality of the country, but also try to see what is the distance between the legal obligations and the information that you can find available on websites. So regarding political finance transparency in Luxembourg, what you can see here is the overall performance of the country. The country scores 49% out of 100 in the overall index, and it is the third most opaque country in the region. Again, a reality that is different from the measurement of perceptions, and maybe we can discuss this in the discussion part. But as you can see here, there is certain also coherence between what we are measuring in the T-index, the general transparency indicator, and the indicator regarding political finance transparency. So issues are first the opacity at the local level, given that the legal framework does not properly consider municipal elections. The second problem is that information about campaign expenses is not disaggregated, and this, for instance, has been confirmed by a report by IDEA in 2023. And last, there are also issues with the update of annual accounts of political parties. We can see in the same report from 2023 that the author explains that the last update was made in 2013. So basically, you can see main issues that we can find regarding Luxembourg framework of political finance transparency, but these are only some issues that we wanted to highlight. You can find the full data set on the Data Hub with all the indicators, both for the facto and the jure regarding Luxembourg, and you can do your own assessment of the distance between the legal commitments of the country and the information that is available. Finalizing, so basically the recommendations is first the fully comply of the outstanding GRECO third round recommendations on party funding transparency. The last report is from 2012. GRECO made several recommendations, and by the time that this report was issued, the country had not actually tackled the most important problems regarding this topic. Also to consolidate accounts to include local and regional party branches and affiliated organizations where you can see a weak framework of transparency, and also to publish all party financial data in open, machine-readable format on a single public portal. The recommendations from, for instance, from IDEA and other organizations working on this topic is that this is very important. The information needs to be centralized and needs to be available on one website, and also needs to be machine readable and needs to be available for citizens in a way that can actually change something about the information they are looking for. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nicolas, for really giving us this, the varying distances, particularly around administrative transparency aspects. Yeah, very interesting findings there. I know that a couple of people might have some questions, but I just to kick off just the questions, I'm just curious to know, particularly under the list, the elements of de facto transparency on the administrative side. Do you have any? Is there any hypothesis that you have as to why specific indicators are partial or null versus the ones that are yes? So is there anything in kind of the wider picture across all the varying countries that gives you some ideas to say for Supreme Court rulings or public procurement, as you highlighted, why there's specific ones that are partial and others are more easily available? Is it something to do with administrative burdens? Because you mentioned Luxembourg's withdrawal from the OGP. And in the letter to the OGP that Luxembourg wrote back all the way back then, it mentioned, you know, the bureaucratic burden of implementing the OGP plan. So I'm just wondering if there is something about an administrative burden, hence the low transparency across some measures. I don't know if that's...
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Lina. I will say in the literature, actually, that's one of the main questions. So when there was this boom of transparency policies being implemented in the 90s, in the 2000s, one of the first questions that you could find in political science literature is why some countries invest in transparency, why some countries decide to implement these kind of measures and other countries don't. In the case of Luxembourg, I don't have information about any paper that actually has tried to find about this, but one hypothesis, and it's something that you can also see with other countries that perform very well normally in global indicators, and for instance, corruption indicators, is that given that they are performing this well, and given that in general, in society, there is no demand for this kind of measures, because there is this idea that the country is doing very well in control of corruption, and also because this idea has basically also is being shared by the political elite. You see countries that have like this very interesting reality, you know. So for instance, how Roberto was saying, Luxembourg is doing very well in indicators such as the CPI. But then when you see the actual implementation of transparency measures, you see that the country is lagging behind the rest of the region. So it's a very interesting question, and I think that actually in the case of Luxembourg, it would be interesting to find out why the government has not invested in this kind of policy, and why the country has not taken the political decision of create these kind of measures.
That's incredibly interesting, and I'm just wondering if it's a case of a demand side. There is less of a demand side of accountability across these measures. But Roberto, you had your hand up, please.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, I think the other reason why some of the countries, as Nico was saying, that are at the top of the CPI, are falling behind in terms of transparency, but not only the de facto, but also the jure transparency, is that, at least for the case of Europe and the EU, there was a lot of pressure put on new access, like countries that were accessing the EU at a later stage. So after the expansions of the EU towards the east, corruption was prioritized, or like, let's not say corruption was prioritized, but anti-corruption was prioritized as a way to accessing the EU. So there was, I think, a motivation there for these countries to enact public procurement portals, to make budgets more transparent, to start doing all of this. Whereas for other countries like Luxembourg, like Germany, even Denmark, there were systems there before to sort of keep, let's say, politics clean, but there was never real pressure to change that. And I think now what is more concerning, especially when we look at issues like that I was raising, for example, as part of the Global Corruption Barometer, like this idea that, well, there might still be too much opacity in politics and how decisions are made and so on. That's, I think, where we need to start rethinking the type of information that we publish for the public, right? Because that's where conflict of interest regulation, where your financial disclosure matters and so on. So so far that hadn't been the case. And I think many of the countries at the top of the Corruption Perceptions Index just missed the ball on that one, or just dropped the ball on that one. Another example is that Germany, for example, only started a lobbying register a couple years ago after several scandals in parliament with COVID responses and so on. And I think that is partly why we are seeing many of these countries that are at the top of the CPI slowly backsliding. I think it's time to sort of update the response that these countries give to corruption.
That's a really good, a very good point there. And I think Luxembourg as well also is implementing a transparency register just from December of last year for members of the Chambre des Députés. But there isn't one for local officials. So to the point of the picture from the political finance transparency index. Nico, did you have your hand up, or should we go to questions from the floor?
Yeah, it was just a brief commentary that in the context of my PhD, I'm actually working now on a paper that tries to find out basically the drivers of both legal commitments on political finance transparency, but also the de facto transparency. And in the analysis, one of the main, factors kind of like explaining the variation between countries is actually the waves of democracy. So basically, like countries that democratize way before, and basically the whole system of political parties is very old, kind of like rely on routines, practices, and not so much on legislation. While you can see that countries, for instance, in the East, as Roberto was explaining, there is a very important, influence of international organizations, for instance, GRECO, that basically establish these kind of measures as policies that need to be implemented during the accession process. The funny thing, and some authors explain this, is that even like probably like these countries accessing the European Union actually had before more more extensive frameworks regarding these issues, because actually when these countries democratized during the 90s, they were very eager to regulate the activities of political parties and very eager to regulate, for instance, transparency of financing of politics. So yeah.
No, that's a good point. So just a combination of political will and popular demands for greater transparency happening about the same time. It's really very, very interesting there. But because we do have time, and we certainly wanted to build in time for questions and an interactive aspect to it, I see Ursula's hand up. Ursula, you can unmute yourself.
Yes. Actually, I do have a question. I have two questions, one for Roberto and one for Nicolas. So Nicolas, maybe with you first, I'm a bit puzzled because you said Luxembourg does not publish its current expenditure. Yeah, I saw a no there, right? So you had their various criteria of disclosure, and public expenditure was, current expenditure was a no.
Yes,
And
good question.
unlike Luxembourg, has a AAA rating of financial stability with a positive outlook. I mean, how can that, on which basis has this rating been given if the expenditure is not even known? I mean, a bit puzzled there. You probably don't have the answer, but maybe I have to do some research to find the answer myself. But in my head, it was like, oh, how can that be?
Yes.
Okay,
sorry, because I didn't. If I can
Yeah.
answer now, or do I wait?
Well, if you have the answer, yes, please.
Yes. So basically, we have two different indicators for expenditures. Okay. So we have past expenditures that basically we are looking at the report that the country is publishing with the disaggregated information about expenses by every agency, ministry, etc.
Okay.
In our index, Luxembourg has a full point on that.
Yeah. Okay.
We have a second indicator that is called current expenditures, and we call it a budget tracker. This is something that not a lot of countries have, and basically are countries that have fully digitalized their, for instance, public procurement systems, but also basically have established a website where citizens can go. And for instance, if I want to see what are the expenditures of a specific public hospital in my region, you can go there and you can find that.
Okay.
You know, with
And
digital
that's not needed
invoice.
for the SAP index, of course.
Exactly,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. And that's what I mean. If you go to our index, you're gonna see that only very few countries have this kind of like public
Makes sense. Thank you very much.
No worries.
Yeah, and then the other question for Roberto was, so you described the CPI, and then you described the data sources of the CPI, which are the World Economic Forum, the Bertelsmann Foundations, World Bank, and so on. Now, I mean, I know it's about perception, but where does, let's say, Bertelsmann Stiftung get their information about corruption in Luxembourg, or the perception of it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So every organization has a slightly different methodology on how they obtain this. We have some that rely exclusively on business surveys, like the World Economic Forum. So they just send out a number of surveys to companies in the country, and that's how they get the data. There are others like VDEM, for example, that rely on academics in the country and regional experts as well to assess a series of questions around corruption. And some others rely just on expert assessments of like 2 or 3 country experts that are selected in there. So
they do have representatives in Luxembourg, like contact people who feed them with information?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So for most, in most cases, most of the sources do have like a connection to the country. There are some that are assessed, I would say, remotely. I don't think there's a presence in North Korea, for example.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it is a combination of in-country experts that sometimes are also paired with, in the case, since you asked for the Bertelsmann Foundation specifically, they have in-country experts, then they have an international expert, they pair them together, and then there's a panel of regional experts that also weigh then the regional responses to make sure that like all of this makes sense. So that is the system that the Bertelsmann Foundation follows, but like I said, the methodology is slightly different in each one of them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ursula, and thank you, Nico and Roberto, for those answers. Just from the floor as well, participants, are there any other questions? You can put your hand up if you have a question. Alejandro.
So yeah, my question is to the researchers. Do you know, in terms of perception, did the work of the press influence the perception of the citizen? If now there have been a few scandals in Luxembourg in regard to fraud, so I wanted to know if did you think that people are more aware than they were in the past of the risk of corruption? That's my question. Thank you.
It's a very good question. Yeah, the role of media reports, increasing headlines of scandals, of illicit flows passing through structures domiciled in Luxembourg, maybe that playing a role in shaping perceptions that have that effect on what we assume to be actual corruption behavior. So, Roberto, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I mean, that is, I think, an assessment that is very common, that of course perceptions of corruption will increase the minute that you have a scandal or that you have more media coverage on the issue. And that is precisely the reason why the Corruption Perceptions Index does not integrate the public perceptions, not because they do not matter, but because they are more volatile based on that. There is research, however, that does show that this is a bit of a curve as well. At the beginning, when you start exposing this, then yes, the perceptions start going up and up and up and up. But then at some point, that sort of stops, let's say. And there's also, I mean, I would still say it is important, regardless of what effect this has on perceptions, to still have, I would say, like to appreciate the role of the media on this fight against corruption, right? Because at the same time, by bringing this up, you might also be creating a sort of dissuading element for politicians to engage in this type of activities. So even though in the short run you might have a bit of a bump, I think it is still worth it. And that is also why it is important to also take perceptions, especially when you see something like this, with a grain of salt, but not discard them completely. I think I mean, we have seen elections around the world being lost based on scandals like this, right? So that's why perceptions in this regard matter. So I would say, yeah, the problem is not the spike that the media has on perceptions. The problem is that this is happening at all. That the corruption is happening at all. And then the reaction that we see, I would say, is the normal, healthy reaction of a society. We have seen, and that's also something that we captured with the Global Corruption Barometer at some point, places where you don't see this bump in the perceptions of corruption after a scandal or after a very strong, let's say, authoritarian turn or something like that. And that often does not mean that corruption has been eradicated. It's often more an issue of people are just terrified of answering the survey honestly, right? So I think it's also important to keep that in mind. And like I said from the beginning, I think no metric of corruption can be taken at like full face value by itself, right? It's important to give it context with other metrics and triangulate it with something else. But I hope that answers the question a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nico, did you want to add something? I see Nicolas' hand up. The other Nicolas. So maybe we'll take, in the interest of time, we have, yeah, Nicolas, please ask your question.
Thank you so much. Just a quick question for Roberto. I've been recently reading a lot about the index and the barometer regarding Italy, for example. I was interested in my own country, so I read through the two scores, and I saw the big difference between the two indexes. And this made me also think about how perception can be shaped by media, indeed. And I know that for my country, especially, there's an overexposure to scandals, which, okay, may impact the general public because maybe they don't have the tools and the instruments to also understand when like media are over-exaggerating a certain event for that or the other reason. However, it can influence also business people and experts because they are indeed, I would say, involved in the cultural environment of a country that has a long-standing history of corruption scandals. And on top of that, there's also the fact that probably from a linguistic perspective, when it comes to the word corruption, at least in Italian, it really creates multiple layers of meaning, which can also impact again basically the perception of the phenomena. Because if I think in Italian about corruption, it can be also political corruption in the sense that the political party currently governing, I don't like it, so they are not very good, and this is for me a corrupted way of governing the country. So I'm very much, I would say, astonished when I read the perception and the barometer because they are very different for this country. And then I see that, for example, France or Germany, they're scoring very well in the index, but in barometer they are lower than Italy. So this is maybe what we can also explore in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Roberto, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. No, I
think Roberto's video, I don't know if it's the same for everyone, has frozen. Yes? Okay. We have, I think he will leave and come back. We have a question in the chat that I think Nico,
I think I'm back.
Yes.
Sorry, I think the internet in Berlin is suffering from the heat. I don't know what's happening.
Just like the trains.
Yes, exactly. I don't know what's going on. But no, I think the gap that you're referring to between the Global Corruption Barometer and the Corruption Perceptions Index also tells a story, right? And I think what the Corruption Perceptions Index tells you, with Italy starting to score better, is that it appears that the government is doing certain things that are helping to bring corruption under control. At the same time, it appears that what the government has not managed to do is convince people that this is what's happening. And that would be my reading of it. And that is why it is important to triangulate these metrics with something like what Nico showed us in the case of Italy, right? So what has happened? It is possible that Italy made public procurement systems more visible or centralized them, or now there's more transparency also in how budgets are spent, or there's a lot that has been done in bringing corrupt officials to justice and stuff like this. And I think that might be enough to move the opinions of experts, but not enough to regain the citizens' trust. And I think that is why, rather than seeing this as like, well, both metrics are flawed, it's like we need to dig a little bit deeper and see, okay, where is this disconnect coming from, and how do we then convince people that we're actually doing something, right? There might also be a communications angle there. And like coming from Mexico myself, what I can tell you is that often a lot of these recommendations that we might give as Transparency International about, transparency platforms and so on, are perhaps too technical for people to actually see them on their everyday lives on a daily basis. Because as Nico was saying as well, or as we have discovered as well through our research on Bridge Gap, it is often not the everyday citizen that logs into a public procurement database or a database of financial disclosure for politicians and so on. It's often either experts or civil society with more technical expertise on the matter, which is why this is so important to have in a country, right? But it will take longer for citizens to be convinced that this is working or that something is being done. And I think that is why it is also important to keep track of those metrics.
Thank you. Really good points there. I don't know, Nico, would you like to add, or should I, just in the interest of time, ask the two questions we have in the chat?
Maybe just to mention that also in the literature, there is this question about transparency and perception of corruption, and it's not very clear, right? Because actually sometimes what happens is that implementation of transparency measures bring the possibility of like discovery scandals. There is more information available, and this could also have the effect of increasing the perception in society of the existence of this kind of conducts. So yes, just to mention that this relationship between these two factors is not very clear, and actually it could be the other way around.
Yeah, there are tensions to measure, to expose, to report. Yeah. So we have two questions from a bunch of letters. Very interesting points on the findings from Latino Americana perspective. The gap between institutional compliance with international standards and actual corruption perception suggests the reputational incentive may be stronger than normative internalization. How does this pattern, how is this pattern reflected in your regional data? Does either of you have some responses to that question of how does this pattern of the gap between institutional compliance and international standards and actual corruption suggest a reputational incentive may be stronger, reputational incentive stronger than normative internalization? Roberto.
I mean, I can maybe just answer from a very anecdotal point of view, which is just in a way, the power of the Corruption Perceptions Index in itself. In the sense that a lot of the time, when I am invited to speak about corruption or whatever, is just because of the Corruption Perceptions Index, and the conversation is not really about what do we do to improve governance, integrity, and so on in the country, but the question becomes, how do we improve on your index? And then there's a bit of frustration when you tell them, well, the index is measuring corruption more in the abstract way, not like what Nico is doing, which is much more, let's say, specific, right? And at the same, it's just like in a way, there's value in having more specific indicators that you know what needs to be fixed. At the same time, and what we have seen as well is that when you have something like that, it's easy to game the system, right? And then you just pass a new law, you just start a new platform, and then that is fixed and you do better. And with the Corruption Perceptions Index, I think the answer is always, well, it's going to be an effort of, you need to fix this, you need to fix that, and you also need to keep this over time, and then you will start seeing results here and there. But I think that in a way shows how the fact that the Corruption Perceptions Index might affect a country's reputation is really what is driving, in many cases, this reform efforts, rather than, I would say, an honest willingness of making things better. I think in many cases, this is just a way to, because many of these discussions happen with countries that just want to attract foreign investment, that want to attract business. And then it just really becomes a matter of monitoring the reputation, right? And I think that in a way speaks, at least to me, I think speaks volumes.
Yeah, so just the question of the perception of political expedience and economic expedience on the side of political actors, which is something that occurs everywhere. So there's a last question. We have from GCB 2020, Luxembourg has worse scores in the business executives and bankers than public sector. What do you suggest in terms of improving the ABC, so anti-bribery convention compliance, I think, for Luxembourg's financial institutions in general? What should the financial institutions do, and what should the public authority do? So if you can answer that in 1 minute, that would be great.
I mean, I can try, but I think in a way the answer is, I mean, of course it is important to address that issue. But if you look at the results from the survey and also from the Eurobarometer together, and not just question by question, you see that the real, I think that the real risk that people are perceiving is about the relationship between the companies and politicians, right? And I think then Nico showed how what we don't have in Luxembourg is very well developed financial disclosure for politicians or campaign finance regulations, right? And I think that is precisely the in for many of these companies and the public sector to maybe try and buy favors, try and get preferential treatment, and try to bypass established processes on how to do business, and maybe get a more, and start becoming the darling company of the incoming government, right? And so I think that is the real thing. What we do in terms of anti-bribery convention, especially for bribing abroad and so on, would be great. And of course, you can always strengthen your financial intelligence unit. You can always do more for AML. But I think here, the core of the matter is, I think, what Nico was showing with his index, that political campaign finance is still very opaque, and that is not being very well received by people anymore.
Yeah, and there is a strong messaging around competitiveness from the Luxembourgish government and the way in which the administration postures itself. So yeah, that short corridor between politics, widening that short corridor between politics and business will be quite a challenge. Nico, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
Yeah, so maybe we can share now or later the websites where we have this information. So as I was speaking, we rely on feedback. So for instance, if you see that information that we are publishing is not updated, or you have another website, or you are not agreeing with the score that we are granting, this information is very important for us. So please go to T-Index and also to the Political Finance Transparency Index and give us your feedback, because we are always looking to receive this information for people living in the countries with expertise, so we can improve the assessment that we are making.
Absolutely perfect. And I have contributed as well. So certainly there's a lot of resources that you can draw on and research findings. There's a question about the presentations in the chat chat. I will follow up on that. But BridgeGap's website has a ton of their research findings, and the data is available and accessible, as well as the methodology. Similarly, for Transparency International, you can access these resources. There you go, in the chat. So we have reached the end of our time for today. It has been really helpful to see how these layers of measurement give us almost like different lenses for looking at the control of corruption and transparency in Luxembourg, and the balance between the broader picture and the specificity of the T index has been really helpful for us, and at L4T will be really helpful for our advocacy moving forward. So thank you so very much, Roberto, for joining us today, this very, very hot day. And Nico, for joining us from Chile. We know you have the flu, so thank you so much for making the time. And to everyone, thank you as well for staying for the hour and a couple of minutes. It is warm where you are, I'm sure. So please stay hydrated, please stay safe. This is our last webinar to end for the summer, and we'll be back with an exciting new program at the end of the holidays. So thank you so very much. Thank you, Timo.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.